Imagine a world without countries, without laws, without anything you recognize as civilization. Now, picture the birth of the first empire. Do you see grand cities and wise rulers? The reality was far darker. Humanity's first empire wasn't built on ideals. It was forged in fire, drenched in blood, and held together by fear. Forget everything you think you know about ancient history, because today, we're diving into the brutal, unfiltered truth of how the first great powers were really established. Before any emperor could claim a throne, they had to conquer. This wasn't a noble quest. It was a ruthless campaign of annihilation. Every decision was defined by conquest, cruelty, and an insatiable hunger for power. The concept of human rights didn't exist. Life for an ordinary person was a terrifying lottery. Your survival depended not on your skills or kindness, but on your obedience, your physical strength, or simply being lucky enough to not be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Kings and warlords declared themselves rulers, often claiming divine right, but their authority came from one place and one place only: the tip of a spear. Let's talk about what building an empire really meant. It meant that entire cities could be surrounded, starved out, and then utterly destroyed. Imagine watching your home burn to the ground, not as a casualty of war, but as a deliberate act of terror. Populations weren't just defeated, they were often massacred or enslaved to make an example for others who might dare to resist. The message was simple and brutal: submit or be erased. The very foundations of these new imperial cities were often mixed with the ashes of the old ones. Progress, in this era, was measured in skulls. And what about life within these new empires? For the vast majority, it was a waking nightmare. Slaves, captured in war or born into bondage, were considered property, tools to be used and discarded. They built the grand monuments, tilled the fields, and worked in the mines until their bodies gave out. But it wasn't just the enslaved who suffered. Even the common farmers and laborers lived under the constant threat of forced labor or conscription. One day you could be tending your small plot of land, and the next you could be marched hundreds of miles away to build a palace or die on a distant battlefield. The soldiers who enforced the emperor's will weren't safe either. They were instruments of the state, often just as expendable as the enemies they fought. A soldier's life was cheap. They faced brutal discipline, meager rations, and the constant probability of a violent death, all for the glory of a ruler who might not even know their name. In this world, loyalty wasn't earned through respect. It was commanded through fear. A single mistake, a moment of hesitation, could mean execution. This was the machinery of the empire grinder that consumed human lives from both the top and the bottom to fuel its expansion. Justice and morality as we understand them were non-existent. The laws that did exist were not designed for fairness. They were tools of control. Their primary purpose was to protect the property of the powerful and to crush any hint of dissent. Stealing a loaf of bread could get you the same punishment as plotting a rebellion, a swift and public death. This public brutality wasn't just punishment, it was theater. It was a performance designed to terrify the population into submission. Order was maintained not through a shared sense of community, but through the ever-present threat of violence. Daily life was a fragile existence. Famine was a constant companion, as the empire's demands often stripped farming communities of their harvests, leaving them to starve while granaries overflowed in the capital. Disease could sweep through a city in days, with no medical knowledge to stop it. If you spoke out, if you questioned authority, if you tried to organize any form of resistance, the consequence was absolute. There were no trials, no appeals. There was only the swift, brutal hand of imperial power. This was the dawn of empire, a world where ambition was valued above all else, and human lives were just a resource to be spent. It is a chilling reminder that the first steps toward what we call civilization were taken on a path paved with bones. The order they created came at a staggering cost, and the foundation of their progress was, quite literally, blood. The first topic is rise through conquest. Have you ever wondered how the first great empires were born? Was it through grand speeches, wise laws, or peaceful alliances? The truth is far darker and more brutal. The birth of empire wasn't a dawn of civilization. It was a storm of fire, steel, and blood. It was forged not in council chambers, but on the battlefield, where ambition was measured in fallen enemies and conquered lands. Imagine a world without borders, a patchwork of tribes and city-states, each fighting for survival. Into this chaos stepped leaders of a different breed. These weren't just kings. They were warlords, visionaries of violence who understood a simple, terrifying truth. Power isn't given, it's taken. And they were ready to pay the price in blood, anyone's blood but their own. Their strategy was relentless conquest. Armies, vast and disciplined, didn't just march to defend. They marched to devour. Every city in their path faced a stark choice: submit or be annihilated. The stories that trickled out from conquered lands were not of liberation, but of horror. Cities razed to the ground, fields salted, and populations either put to the sword or shackled into slavery. These weren't just acts of war, they were messages. Brutal warnings carved into the landscape for all to see. The message was simple: resistance is futile. Fear was their most effective weapon, spreading faster than any army. Let's talk about the architects of these first empires. Men like Sargon of Akkad, often hailed as the first empire builder. He didn't unite Mesopotamia with handshakes and treaties. He did it by crushing his rivals, one by one. His inscriptions boast of washing his weapons in the sea, a poetic way of saying his dominion stretched from one end of the known world to the other. His rule was maintained by a network of loyal governors, but also by the constant threat of his military might. Any hint of rebellion was met with overwhelming force. He established a precedent that would echo through history. The language of empire is written in force. Or consider the Assyrians, a name that became synonymous with terror for centuries. Their military was a machine of unparalleled efficiency and cruelty. They mastered siege warfare, using massive battering rams and towering siege engines to breach the most formidable walls. But their true weapon was psychological warfare. Assyrian art is filled with graphic depictions of their conquests, endless lines of captives being led away, rebels being impaled on stakes outside their own city walls. These weren't just historical records, they were propaganda, designed to break the will of their enemies before a single arrow was fired. They wanted you to know that defeat wasn't just a possibility. It was an agonizing, drawn-out nightmare. But conquest wasn't just about open warfare. The shadows were just as bloody as the battlefield. Espionage, assassination, and betrayal were the currency of power. Alliances were temporary flags of convenience, ready to be discarded the moment they became inconvenient. A king who trusted his neighbor today might find that neighbor's army at his gates tomorrow. Treaties were written on clay tablets, but loyalty was written in fear and a moment of weakness, a poorly guarded secret. A disloyal general, any of these could bring a kingdom crashing down. The political landscape was a viper's nest, where the deadliest strike often came from the one closest to you. For the ordinary person, the rise of an empire was a seismic event that shattered their world. One day you were a farmer, a craftsman, a merchant, living according to the traditions of your ancestors. The next, you were a subject. Your gods might be replaced, your language suppressed, your sons conscripted into the very army that conquered you. Tribute was demanded: grain, livestock, silver, and often human lives. You were no longer a member of a community. You were a resource for the imperial machine, your labor and loyalty extracted under the constant threat of violence. Families were torn apart, with the young and strong often taken as slaves or laborers to build the empire's grand cities and monuments. The very ground beneath your feet might no longer feel like your own. To control these vast, diverse, and resentful populations, rulers used more than just soldiers. They used ideas. Religion and law became powerful tools of control. Rulers declared themselves gods, or the chosen representatives of the gods on earth. Their conquests weren't acts of aggression, they were the execution of divine will. This ideology was a powerful sedative. How can you rebel against a king who is also a god? How can you question a war that has been sanctioned by the heavens? Temples were built, new priesthoods were established, and local beliefs were either absorbed or erased. By intertwining faith with fear, the empire could command obedience without having a soldier on every street corner. Law, too, was codified and enforced, not always for justice, but for order, the empire's order. It standardized straight and punishment, but it also reinforced the new hierarchy, with the conquerors at the top and the conquered at the bottom. So, when we look back at the gleaming monuments of the first empire, the palaces, the pyramids, we must remember what lies beneath their foundations. Not just stone and mortar, but bones. The bones of soldiers who died taking a city, and the bones of those who died defending it. The lives of countless anonymous people, sacrificed on the altar of ambition. The rise of the First Empire was a masterclass in brutality, a symphony of violence. History isn't always heroic. Often, it's a ghost story, and the ghosts are still whispering their warnings from beneath the ruins of forgotten capitals. The second topic is the price of power. What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are peeling back the gilded layers of history to uncover a dark and often overlooked truth: the real price of power in the ancient world. When we picture the first empires, we often think of magnificent pyramids, sprawling cities, and kings dripping in gold. But what was the human cost of all that glory? How was that power truly maintained? The answer is far grimmer than the monuments suggest. For the kings and rulers at the very top, life was a spectacle of wealth, influence, and prestige. They commanded armies, built wonders, and their word was law. But this luxurious existence was balanced on a knife's edge. Power in the first empires was not just held, it was fiercely, brutally defended. The single greatest fear of any ruler was losing control. One defiant village, one disgruntled general, one whisper of rebellion could ignite a fire that would consume the entire kingdom. So, fear became an instrument of rule, as vital as any sword or spear. Public, gruesome punishments were not just about justice. They were a form of political theater, a clear and bloody message to anyone who dared to challenge the throne. The message was simple: obedience is survival. But while the rulers lived in constant paranoia, it was the ordinary people who bore the true weight of the empire on their backs. Farmers, laborers, craftsmen, the vast majority of the population were the engine that powered the imperial machine. Their lives were a relentless cycle of toil. They were obligated to surrender a significant portion of their crops and goods as taxes. These weren't just contributions, they were demands. Failure to meet the quota wasn't met with understanding, it was met with punishment, beatings, imprisonment, or having your land and livelihood stripped away. In Manikas's families were legally tied to the land they worked, generation after generation, with no hope of social mobility. They were cogs in a system designed to extract as much labor and resources as possible, fueling the ambitions of a distant ruler they would likely never see. Their sweat built the palaces, and their harvests fed the armies, but they themselves often lived on the brink of starvation. Even the soldiers, the very symbols of imperial might, paid a steep price. We might imagine them as conquerors, but for the average foot soldier, life was a brutal mix of discipline, danger, and deprivation. They faced death not only from enemy armies but also from disease, starvation on long campaigns, and the unforgiving cruelty of their own commanders. They were tools of expansion, sent to fight and die for territories they would never own, and for a glory they would rarely share. A soldier's life was cheap, and their loyalty was often secured through the same fear that controlled the civilian population. They were caught between the enemy in front and the executioner behind. This entire structure was built upon a foundation of staggering inequality. A tiny elite nobles, high priests, and military generals lived in a world of unimaginable luxury. They feasted while others starved. They enjoyed legal protections that the common person could only dream of. The law, in fact, wasn't created to ensure fairness for all. It was designed to maintain the existing social order, to protect the property and privileges of the powerful, and to keep the masseuse in their place. Justice was not blind. It saw status, wealth, and power very clearly. For the common person, the law was not a shield. It was a cage. How did rulers convince millions of people to accept this oppressive reality? This is where the power of belief and ideology comes into play. Rulers didn't just claim power through force. They claimed it through divine right. They positioned themselves as the chosen representatives of the gods on earth. Priests and state-sponsored religions reinforced this narrative, teaching the populace that the king's authority was sacred and that the social order was divinely ordained. To question the king was to question the gods themselves. This cultural and religious manipulation was incredibly effective. It framed obedience as a moral and spiritual duty, and it justified the suffering of the masses as a necessary sacrifice for maintaining cosmic order and stability. It was a brilliant and chilling form of psychological control. So, while the ruler at the top was technically the most powerful person in the empire, their life was far from serene. Maintaining this complex web of fear, force, and faith required constant vigilance. The court was a viper's nest of intrigue and conspiracy. Ambitious relatives, powerful generals, and rival factions were always watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. A military defeat, a famine, or a simple miscalculation could be the opening they needed to strike. The ruler had to be a master politician, a ruthless strategist, and an expert at sniffing out betrayal. In this sense, the imperial court was as much a battlefield as any frontier. The struggle for power wasn't just against external enemies. It was a constant, internal war where the prize was the throne, and the penalty for losing was almost always a violent death. When we look back at the first empires, it's easy to be mesmerized by their achievements, the art, the architecture, the sheer scale of their influence. But it's crucial to remember the dark reality that made it all possible. The stability and security enjoyed by the few were purchased with the misery, toil, and blood of the many. The glory of the empire was built on a mountain of human sacrifice. It's a harsh lesson from history, reminding us that power is never free. It always has a price, and it's rarely paid by the people who hold it. This wasn't just a quirk of the ancient world. It's a dynamic that has echoed through the centuries, a timeless warning about the nature of power itself. The third topic is slavery and oppression. Have you ever wondered what really held ancient empires together? It wasn't just grand armies or magnificent monuments. A much darker force was at play. Imagine a world where your entire life is decided the moment you're born, where freedom is a luxury for the few, and fear is the air everyone breathes. This was the reality for millions under the iron fist of the first great empires. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on this brutal truth. We'll explore how slavery wasn't just a side effect of conquest, but the very engine that powered imperial expansion. We'll see how entire populations were systematically oppressed, not just for labor, but to break their spirit and ensure absolute control. So, how did these rulers maintain such a tight grip over vast territories? What was it like to live as a slave, building the very roads that carried your captors to further conquests? What happened to the ordinary citizens, the farmers and artisans, caught in this web of power and fear? Join me as we journey back in time to uncover the chilling methods of control, the psychological warfare, and the human cost of building an empire. This is the story of how power was built on the backs of the broken, a story of slavery and oppression that shaped our world in ways you might never have imagined. Let's begin. One of the darkest pillars of the first great empires was, without a doubt, slavery and systematic oppression. As rulers ambitiously expanded their territories, conquering new lands wasn't just about gaining ground. It was about controlling the people who lived there. For those who survived the initial onslaught of battle, a grim fate often awaited. They were stripped of their freedom, their identities, and their futures. They became property, forced into labor, and treated as disposable assets in the grand imperial machine. These slaves were absolutely essential to the empire's function. Picture the immense construction projects, the colossal temples, the sprawling palaces, the thousands of miles of roads connecting the empire. Who built them? Slaves. Picture the vast fields of grain that fed the armies and the cities. Who worked them from sunrise to sunset? Slaves. They carried heavy supplies for the legions. They toiled in dangerous mines. And they served silently in the households of the wealthy. Their lives were not their own. Every moment was controlled by a master, and any hint of disobedience, any sign of defiance, could be met with unimaginably brutal consequences. But the oppression didn't stop with those in chains. The system was designed to control everyone. Ordinary citizens, the so-called free people of the empire, were also subjected to harsh and unyielding rules. They faced excessive taxation, with imperial officials demanding a huge portion of their crops, their earnings, or their goods to fund the lavish lifestyles of the elite and the endless military campaigns. If they couldn't pay, they could lose their land, their homes, and even their freedom, falling into debt bondage, which was just another form of slavery. Forced labor wasn't just for slaves either. Citizens could be conscripted at any time to work on state projects, leaving their own farms and families to struggle. Imagine being a farmer and suddenly being ordered to leave your harvest to go build a wall hundreds of miles away, with no pay and meager rations. This was a constant threat, a reminder that the state's needs always came before your own. The family unit, the very core of society, was not safe from the empire's reach. Families could be torn apart without a moment's notice. Children were sometimes taken from their parents for various purposes. Some were chosen to be trained as soldiers from a young age, molded into loyal warriors for the empire. Others were taken as laborers for state workshops. In a particularly cruel tactic, the children of local nobles or regional leaders would be taken as political hostages, sent to the imperial capital to be educated, but in reality, to ensure their parents' loyalty. One wrong move from a provincial governor, and their child would pay the price. In this rigid society, the idea of climbing the social ladder was mostly a fantasy. Social mobility was nearly impossible. The circumstances of your birth almost always determined your entire life's trajectory. If you were born a farmer, you died a farmer. If you were born a slave, your children would be slaves. The powerful elites, born into wealth and privilege, held all the cards. They owned the land, controlled the military, and wrote the laws, creating a system designed to keep them at the top and everyone else at the bottom. This created a society of deep, permanent inequality, where the dreams and potential of millions were crushed before they could even begin. So, with all this suffering and inequality, Why didn't the empire just collapse under the weight of constant rebellion? The answer is simple and terrifying. Fear. Fear was the most effective and widely used tool of control. The empire's rulers understood that you couldn't have a soldier on every street corner. Instead, you could make the people police themselves through terror. Public punishments were a common and deliberate spectacle. Imagine walking into the city square and seeing people being flogged, branded, or crucified. These weren't hidden away, they were performed in the most public places for all to see. The goal was to make an example of the disobedient, to burn a horrifying image into the minds of the populace. A thief might have their hand cut off. A rebel might be executed in a slow, agonizing way. These gruesome displays served as a constant, silent warning. This is what happens when you defy the empire. These acts of violence weren't random. They were carefully orchestrated to prevent rebellion, instill absolute obedience, and demonstrate that no one, not even the powerful or wealthy, was beyond the ruler's reach. A nobleman who plotted against the emperor could be stripped of his titles, his wealth confiscated, and his entire family punished, showing that even the elite were subject to the supreme authority. This created a climate where suspicion was everywhere, and people were afraid to even speak of dissent, lest a neighbor or even a family member report them. But the oppression wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Culture and religion were twisted into tools of control. Conquered peoples were often forced to abandon their own gods and traditions. Instead, they were required to participate in the empire's official religious rituals. In many cases, this included worshipping the ruler himself as a living god or a chosen representative of the divine. This practice served multiple purposes. Firstly, it reinforced the social hierarchy. If the emperor is a god, then his laws are divine commands, and to disobey him is to commit a sacrilege. The fourth topic is life under fear. Imagine waking up every day where your first thought isn't about breakfast, but about survival, where every word you speak, every choice you make, could be your last. This was the reality for millions living under the first great empires. It was a life dominated by one powerful, pervasive emotion: fear. This wasn't the kind of fear you feel watching a scary movie. It was a cold, constant anxiety, a weight on the soul. It dictated everything: what you said, where you went, even what you thought. Step out of line, and the consequences were swift and brutal. Fear wasn't just a byproduct of imperial rule. It was the very engine that powered it. Rulers weren't just leaders. They were masters of psychological warfare. They understood that to control millions, you didn't need to love them. You needed them to be afraid. Laws weren't just rules. They were chains. And public punishments were the horrifying spectacles designed to keep those chains tight. Picture this: the town square, bustling with people, not for a market or a festival, but to witness an execution. A person, perhaps a neighbor, accused of dissent or theft, is brought out. The sentence is carried out in front of everyone, women and even children. The message was brutally clear, seared into the memory of every onlooker. This is what happens when you defy us. Your survival depends on your absolute, unquestioning obedience. This public display of violence wasn't random. It was a calculated performance of power. The goal was to make the state's authority feel absolute and inescapable. It turned every citizen into a potential spectator of horror, and in doing so, reinforced their own compliance. The empire didn't just rule by the sword. It ruled by the terror the sword inspired. But the fear wasn't limited to these dramatic public displays. It seeped into the most mundane aspects of daily life. For a farmer, it was the dread of not meeting the state's grain quota. A bad harvest wasn't just a financial loss. It could mean a flogging, imprisonment, or the seizure of your land, leaving your family to starve. Every sunrise brought the pressure to produce, not for your own prosperity, but to satisfy the insatiable appetite of the empire. For an artisan or a laborer, it was the constant scrutiny of an overseer. One mistake, one moment of slowness, and the sting of a whip was a sharp reminder of your place. Workers were often pushed to their physical limits, treated as little more than cogs in a vast, uncaring machine. Their lives were measured in output, and their value was tied directly to their ability to serve the state. There was no sick leave, no workers' rights, just the endless demand for more. Even children weren't spared. From their earliest years, they were taught the rigid hierarchy of their world. The lessons were simple and stark. Obey your parents, obey the officials, obey the emperor. Don't ask questions, don't have your own ideas. Individuality was dangerous. Compliance was safety. Schools, if they existed, were not centers of enlightenment but factories for producing obedient subjects. This constant, low-level stress had a profound psychological impact. It shaped behavior, making people inherently cautious and distrustful. Who could you confide in? A neighbor could be an informant. A friend could betray you to save their own skin. The fear of being reported was just as potent as the fear of the state itself. This created a society where people began to police themselves. Families would enforce the state's rules on their own members, not out of loyalty to the empire, but out of a desperate need to protect them from harm. "Don't say that. Someone might hear you," became a common refrain. This internalization of control is the ultimate victory for any authoritarian regime. When people start censoring their own thoughts, the state doesn't need as many guards on the streets. The prison becomes the mind itself. And what about the military? The very backbone of the empire. You might think soldiers, the wielders of imperial power, would be immune to this fear. But they were, perhaps, its most refined subjects. A soldier's life was built on a foundation of discipline, enforced through terror. Disobeying an order, showing a moment of hesitation in battle, could mean immediate execution by your own commander. They were systematically broken down as individuals and rebuilt as extensions of the emperor's will. They were trained to see their own lives as expendable, to march into certain death without question. Their loyalty was not a choice. It was a condition of their existence. The fear of their own officers often outweighed the fear of the enemy. This brutal conditioning created the unstoppable legions that conquered vast territories, but it came at an unimaginable human cost. Living in this climate of fear suffocated the human spirit. Where was the room for creativity when any new idea could be seen as a threat? Where was the space for art that wasn't state-sanctioned propaganda? Where was the opportunity for scientific inquiry that might challenge established dogma? Innovation, progress, and personal expression were all casualties of this system. The empire demanded conformity, and it got it, but at the price of stagnation. So, while we marvel at the grand monuments these empires left behind, the colossal pyramids, the sprawling walls, the magnificent temples, we must also remember the invisible foundation upon which they were built. They were built on the sweat, the blood, and the fear of ordinary people. Life under the first empires was a relentless test of endurance. It was a masterclass in how to use fear not just as a weapon, but as the very architecture of a society. The more fear permeated daily life, the more absolute the ruler's control became. This is the dark and complex legacy of Empira's story of monumental achievement built upon a foundation of human suffering. The fifth topic is building an empire in blood. Have you ever wondered what it truly took to build the first great empires? It wasn't just about strategy or leadership. The real foundation, the mortar holding every stone together, was something far darker. It was blood, fear, and unimaginable sacrifice. Imagine a world where every grand palace, every paved road, every aqueduct was paid for, not with coin, but with human lives. The early rulers, the first emperors, understood a brutal, unwritten law. To build something monumental, something that would last for centuries, you needed to be absolutely ruthless. Power demanded cruelty, and the survival of their creation depended on unwavering, absolute obedience. This wasn't an empire that grew slowly and peacefully. It expanded like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Battles weren't just fought to gain new territory. They were spectacles of power, designed to send a clear message to the entire known world. The message was simple: we are unstoppable. If a city dared to resist, it was not merely conquered, it was erased from existence. Its walls were torn down, its people either enslaved or executed in public displays of force. These massacres were strategic. The stories, whispered in terrified tones from one village to the next, ensured that fear traveled much faster than any army ever could. Rebellion wasn't just suppressed, the very thought of it was extinguished before it could even begin. The empire thrived because it left no room, no air, for defiance to breathe. But who paid the ultimate price for this grandeur? It was the ordinary people, the silent majority whose names are lost to history. Farmers toiled from sunrise to sunset, their backs breaking to feed the ever-hungry armies and the lavish lifestyles of the elite. Builders, often working in brutal, unforgiving conditions, constructed the very infrastructure of power that kept them oppressed. Young men were conscripted, becoming soldiers who fought and died on distant frontiers, either to expand the empire's reach or to enforce its iron will upon their own kind. And at the very bottom were the slaves, their lives considered entirely expendable, performing the most grueling, soul-crushing tasks imaginable. Every single person, from the farmer to the soldier, contributed to this massive engine of authority, whether they wanted to or not. Their individual lives were just fuel for the imperial fire. To maintain the system, the rulers needed more than just swords and spears. They needed to control the minds of their subjects. Religion, culture, and law were not sources of comfort or justice. They were instruments of control. Emperors declared themselves gods or the chosen, representatives of gods on earth. This divine sanction gave them the moral justification to commit atrocities, to levy crushing taxes, and to demand forced labor from their people. How can you argue with a god? From a young age, children learned a simple, vital lesson. Obedience meant survival, and disobedience meant a swift and often painful death. Over generations, this constant underlying fear became a permanent state of mind. It was simply the way the world worked. In this society, curiosity was a liability. Knowledge was a danger. The only thing that mattered was your usefulness to the empire. Your value as a human being was measured by what you could provide. It's easy to look back and only see the darkness, the cruelty, the suffering, and we should never forget that. But history is never that simple. Even from this brutal foundation, a complex legacy emerged. The roads built by slaves connected once isolated cities, allowing trade and ideas to flourish in ways never before possible. In the grand libraries of the capitals, knowledge from conquered cultures was preserved, catalogued, and sometimes even expanded upon. The very blueprints for modern governance, for large-scale infrastructure, and for complex social organization were forged in this crucible of violence. These advancements, the things we often point to as the triumphs of early civilization, were never free. They were carved directly from the bedrock of human suffering. The story of the first empires is a powerful and deeply unsettling reminder. It teaches us that progress often comes at a terrible cost. These colossal structures of power were not built on noble ideals or compassion. They were built on blood, cemented by fear, and maintained through total obedience. To truly understand the grandeur of our history, the magnificent ruins, and the epic stories, we must also be willing to confront its incredible cruelty. The First Empire stands as a testament to what humanity can achieve, a marvel of organization and ambition. But it also serves as a permanent, chilling warning. Civilization is possible, but its first steps are often taken in the darkest of places. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of history compelling, please consider liking the video and subscribing for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. See you next time.